Okay, well, welcome everyone to this Sky Island virtual coffee break. I hope that you all are having a good start to your day, and I really appreciate you joining us for this discussion about forest fire and what happens in the aftermath. Um, just a few housekeeping notes to say that we will have the audience muted during the presentation. We invite you to add any comments or questions that you have about what I'll be discussing today into the chat window at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I'll do my best to answer questions when we get to the end of my presentation. So I want to start by saying thank you to all of the Sky Island Alliance supporters and volunteers that make it possible for us to protect the diversity of life and lands in the Sky Island region. All of our work is made possible by your generosity, so thank you so much. I also want to start today by sharing how much loss is going on because of fires in the West right now. I decided to do this talk several weeks ago when the fires hadn't reached the level that they have even right now, and these fires are ongoing and burning. So my heart goes out to everyone who's suffering loss because of these fires. It's really it's hard to fathom what's going on, and so many people have lost their homes, people have lost their lives, they've lost access to the outdoors because of bad air quality. And many of us are wondering how places that we love, places where we go and recreate and find inspiration out in open space, are going to be changed because of fire. And so my goal today is really to focus on the optimism that I work to hold on to in the face of fires throughout my career. And I do this not to minimize the impacts, the very real and serious impacts that are happening because of fire, but because I believe that each of us really have to find that strength and energy and optimism to be able to face these fires, whether it's reading about them in the news or working actively to help these forests and these communities heal after fire and to combat climate change. So for me, the only way I know how to go forward is to look for these signs of hope on the landscape. And my goal today is just to share that with you, my personal collection, if you will, of bright spots that I've found in the forest after fire. So before I get on to the meat of all of this talk and take you on this journey with me, I just wanted to let you know that if you've missed any of the coffee breaks in the past and you want to catch up, Megan is going to post in the chat box places for you to go and look at past coffee breaks on our website. And we also have some really good coffee breaks coming up. And in 2 weeks, we're going to be hearing from one of our summer interns from a university in Sonora, Angel, and he's going to talk about more than 40 different springs that he visited that were the first time these springs had been documented through our Spring Seeker program. And so he's going to share those on October 1st, and you can register for that event now. And we also have an exciting launch of our new Sky Island Wildlife Monitoring Network, an introduction to Sky Island photofauna. And that will be happening on October 15th. So we do hope that you'll sign up for those. Those are going to be really fun. And photofauna is going to be an opportunity for you to submit your own wildlife observations in a checklist from your own backyard wildlife cameras. Okay, so turning back to today's topic. When we think about a landscape that has burned, that has suffered from a wildfire, I like to think about, are we focusing on what's been lost, the forest that's half burned, or are we thinking about the forest that's half living, what's still there? For me, this question, and the half is not, it's never half. Of course, the proportion is different in every place and after every fire. But for me, it's this balance, this question. It guides all of the conservation work that we do, whether it's being proactive and coming in to do forest stewardship and restoration in places where fire has been excluded, so that we protect as much of the forest from having catastrophic fire. And it also gives us reasons and focal areas to go and do restoration to protect the forests and the biodiversity that's left behind after a fire passes over. So I like to think about this question, and I'm making an analogy with, you know, is your coffee mug half full or half empty? And it also speaks to us as people in terms of the balance of optimism versus focusing on the loss and focusing on the recovery. And so this is a theme that I want to share with you as we walk through my presentation today. So as I said before in my introduction, this really is a journey of my own experience working in a variety of forests in the American West over the last 15 years. I've had the opportunity as a biologist and then as a restoration and stewardship practitioner working in conservation to visit many forests after they've experienced fire. And I've assembled my own little collection of hope from these experiences, and I want to share those with you today. And I hope that even if one of these things resonates with you, that it'll give you some hope as we face helping to heal our forests in the years and decades ahead. So we're going to fill up this metaphor. I'm going to use the metaphor of a jar. We're going to fill this up with these hopeful signs that do emerge after every fire. Every fire has signs of hope. And I'm going to share with you what I found in fires across the landscape. So one of the first things that I try to think about before I go in and look at a forest that's experienced fire is stepping back and looking at the landscape as a whole. And one of the things I always remind myself is that fire is part of the landscape, and the forests, the landscapes in front of us have burned before. This forest, here's Humboldt County, and the beautiful Coast Redwood Forest has experienced generations, thousands of years of fires that have burned through, in some places have burnt the forest all the way down to the ground, and the forest has come back. It's shaped the pattern of which trees we find in rich places, the size of the trees, the shape of the trees. The fire is so much part of that landscape. It's part of the giant Sequoia forests in the Sierra Nevada on the eastern side of California. Fire has been so important to these forests, and in fact, the giant Sequoia trees can't reproduce unless fires come through. They reproduce with seeds, and I'm going to show you some examples of this, where they actually need ground to be burned all the way down through the soil layer in order for those seeds to germinate. And where I'm speaking to you from today in southeastern Arizona, the forests on our Sky Islands, these mountain ranges that rise up out of the desert through grasslands and oak forests and pine forests at the top, these forests also have burned, and it's a part of their history. So this is one of the things I wanted to start with. It's just for us all to be on the same page, is that when we look out at any landscape we love, anywhere in the world, it has burned before. It may have been very different before the burn, and it's different now, but when you look at a place that you love, just know that fire has been there before, and it's part of its history. And fires are going to be part of this landscape going forward. We've tried for many decades to exclude fire, to prevent them from starting, to control them, and to minimize the fire impact. But really, fires that burn more frequently in many of our forest ecosystems in the West are the healthiest ones. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as a theme as we walk through different forests together. So my bright spot number one for everyone, this is the first river stone, if you will, that we're going to put in that mason jar, is this bright spot that beautiful forests have burned many times before. And that's okay. And it has to be part of these forests' future going forward. Okay, so let's take an actual tour on the ground now. And here are the places that we're going to visit through the West. We're going to start near the San Francisco Bay Area and visit a few forests that have burned in the last decade in the Coast Redwood Forest. Then we're going to jump over to the Sierra Nevada mountains and walk through some mixed conifer forests in those mountains, including giant Sequoia. And then we're going to come back here to Tucson, and we're going to look at a little window into the Bighorn fire that burned in the Santa Catalina Mountains just north of Tucson. So the first place that we're going to visit is the first time that I remember going into a forest right after a fire to look at what had happened. And this was the Lockheed Fire that burned south of San Francisco in the Santa Cruz Mountains. The Lockheed Fire started in 2009, and compared to what we're experiencing this week, it was a relatively small fire, about 2,600 acres of redwood forest burned. And I went into the Scotts Creek area, which is about 4 miles north of Boulder Creek, to look at what had happened. And I went there with other biologists. And I had just finished my dissertation at UC Berkeley studying ferns. And one of the most remarkable things that really struck me then was seeing these singed bases of ferns with fiddleheads coming back out. Now this really stuck with me because I had much of my research career studying the physiology, the ecology of these ferns that grow under the redwood trees. And I knew they were resilient and I knew they were tough. They had to be. They live in the shadow of these giant trees that drop branches on them and really fall on top of ferns. But this was the first seen all of the leaves be removed by a fire. And within a month, these ferns were starting to regrow again. And this was so inspiring to me to see these fiddleheads coming out. And I'm wearing my fern fiddlehead necklace because this is the biggest symbol of hope that I find in forests all the forests that I've visited, is that the ferns have this amazing ability to come back out. Their fronds unfurl, not even in the growing season. It can be within a month after the fire, you're gonna see these leaves emerge. And this is because of the amazing biology of ferns, the morphological structure, if you will, of these plants. They send out leaves from a rhizome below ground. And so the rhizome is a starchy root system, if you will, that has the ability to store a lot of energy so that when maybe an elk comes through and munches the plant, the leaves get knocked off by one of those redwood branches that fall all the time onto the forest floor, or from fire, they have the energy to flush a new crown. And it's one of the most inspiring things to see when you first step foot in a forest after it's burned, is to look for the ferns. They're so bright green and they come back so quickly. When I see that happen, it tells me that the fire was not so hot. It didn't obliterate everything below ground, that there were actually reservoirs of life underground that survived. And so ferns really tell us that we didn't have a catastrophic fire that heated the soil too much, baked it too much. There are living things below there, and they're one of the first things to green up again. So that's the second bright spot. We're gonna add this hope into our mason jar and keep going on our tour. So now we're gonna hop north of San Francisco to a really charming redwood forest called Roy's Redwoods Preserve. It's in West Marin, and it's a place where I've studied sword fern for a number of years. And it experienced a very small fire in 2014 that was actually, there were photographs while the fire was moving through the understory. And you could imagine what a creeping forest floor fire looks like, where it's gonna be singeing off a lot of the plants that are growing down on the forest floor. So I thought this was a really beautiful photo that was captured of this fire in 2014 by the Marin Independent Journal. So I had a chance to go and see it again after the fire, and yep, the ferns are coming back. On the left-hand side, it's a bracken fern, really big fronds that came out within a month of the fire. And then also on the right-hand side, that's a small western sword fern. So similar to the last forest where I showed you these ferns coming out, this was even a very small fern that was putting out a new frond. So a small fern has a small rhizome. It still was able to put out new fronds really quickly, which was exciting. But I wanted to highlight here that it isn't just the plants often that have living tissues that survive below ground. There are many animals that are adapted to be below ground, to be, if you will, sheltering in place during the dry season when these fires are most likely to come through in the West. So in the coast redwood forest, salamanders like this one are deep underground during the dry season. And so, of course, not all of the animals will be okay during a fire, but there are species that are adapted to be below ground, and we do think that they may be able to emerge after a fire has moved past unscathed. And there are examples of even salamanders moving 20 hectares away from a fire to escape it if they were above ground. But because these animals require so much moisture in the environment, they're either found below ground, hiding in logs that may protect them from light fire, or they've moved to areas that are the most moist. So they may be near bodies of water, places that may be less impacted by fire. So I share this as bright spot number 3 because banana slugs are often absent from the environment at the driest times when the risk of fire is greatest. They're hiding below ground, and I'm really hopeful that we'll begin to see them reemerge when the rains come back and the moisture level goes up, and that many of them will have survived the fires that are going on right now. So here, just flashing back again to Roy's Redwoods, here's a picture of the forest after this light fire that came through. Much of the undergrowth below the trees had been removed, but we see the evidence of the fern starting to pop out. You can see a cluster of trees here on the left-hand side. This is California Bay. This is a tree that is known to sprout, so it will have many sprouts that will come out if the tree survives. It can grow new stems after fire. And downslope, you can see redwood trees that have a lot of the black charring on the bark. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about the bark. The bark is fascinating. Now, we all know this, but bark really is the protective layer around trees that can serve an incredibly important function in protecting trees from fire. So most of bark is not living. They're dead tissues where the youngest, newest bark is on the inside and the oldest bark is on the outside of the tree. And I love seeing the stripes of charred black bark with unburned bark in between. And what that means is the tree's been growing and it's been splitting the old bark as the tree increases in girth. So that old fire char, this is a tree that's been growing after the fire. And you can see those really clear bands. That's an indication the tree has grown since the fire, has enough energy to do so, despite the fire coming through. And actually, what we see when we look at the tree ring record of many of these species is that after the tree heals any damage that it suffered during the fire, maybe it needed to replace its leaves or invest in new surface roots or start to heal, grow new bark or heal over a burn scar, they have a growth spurt following fire. And that's because nutrients are recycled in the environment after a fire. Competition goes down for trees that survive because many other plants have been removed. And so it's really interesting to think about the fact that many of these forests, these trees actually can grow quickly after a fire. And so it's fun to see that. Look for that banding pattern on trees, especially in the redwoods. So even when the fire breaches that protective layer, breaches through the bark layer and gets into the wood, it's not necessarily the end of the tree's life. And there are actually some good things that can happen with that kind of fire damage. So here's a crosscut through a redwood where the labels that you're seeing are indicating places that fires have occurred and where the tree has regrown over that fire scar. So these are giving you some markers of time. For this one, it was 12 years between one fire and the next one that caused damage down to the growing layer, down to the wood itself. And then the tree healed over it. And then 15 years later, another one. 11 years later, another one. 21 years, 19 years. And then, oops, we decided we didn't need fire anymore. We started excluding it. And we can see a much bigger jump where it went to 60 years. The longer it went, probably more fuels were building up around that tree. So the fire damage was more intense here, as you can see. And then it was 74 years after that one fire when no more fires happened for this tree. But I'm sharing all of this with you because for me, bright spot number 4 is that redwoods can heal over their burn scars. And it isn't just redwoods. I've seen this in other tree species around the West, where they continue, if the cambium, that living layer between the wood and the bark survives, it begins to grow new bark, new wood over that spot. And that ability to heal allows these trees to deal with the wound from the fire and continue to grow and protect itself. This is going to be quickly followed by bright spot number 5, because even when a burn cavity happens in a tree and it can't be healed, and sometimes, especially if fires are happening very frequently or you have intense fires that burns pretty deeply into a tree, it creates these cavities that are critical habitat. In the coast redwoods, there are 16 different species of bats that live in the forest or migrate through. And the cavities that form in redwood trees are critical sheltering habitat for many of these species. Some of them are maternal roosts for species that are coming through and have their young, and others are actually for overwintering, and there are species that live in those caves within the redwoods throughout the year, which is pretty incredible. So habitat structure for species like bats is formed by fire, and without fire, we wouldn't have places for these bats to roost. So bright spot number 5. Okay, we're going to keep going north in the redwoods, and we're going to go to the Pepperwood Preserve. And this is really close to Santa Rosa. Santa Rosa is a town in California that's been affected by multiple wildfires in recent years that have been incredibly devastating. And the Pepperwood Preserve is interesting because it itself has experienced 2 fires in the last 3 years. And I love the photos from the Pepperwood Preserve because they show the remarkable ability of redwoods in particular to sprout after fire. So both the Tubbs fire and the Kincaid fire burned through the preserve, and the redwoods here are in drier part of the redwood forest range. And these redwoods had basal sprouts that came out really quickly after fire. And I love this image of the bright green sprouts against the charred redwood trunks next to them. Redwoods love to reproduce with these types of sprouts, and we see that pretty quickly after fire when the redwood trees survive. The root systems, the burrows at the bottom of the tree are able to put out new sprouts. And each of these sprouting stems can be the large redwood of the future. They will compete amongst themselves, and some will emerge as the next generation. But it's remarkable how quickly they can get their start following a fire. So that's bright spot number 6, this basal sprouting. It's really inspiring to see these trees put out these new stems so quickly. Then this can be stimulated by prescribed fire. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But sticking with the Pepperwood Preserve, it's one of these places where we also see what I like to call bottle brush trees, where redwoods start putting out new foliage and new branches all over their trunks. All of a sudden, the light environment has changed when many of the branches and the canopy itself has been killed either by the heat or actually burned. But if the cambium layer around the tree's trunk is alive, it will put out these epicormic shoots. And it's really fun to see this. I've seen this on the Big Sur coast and patches of forests that have been burned where this fuzzing out happens. And it's so cool to see this tree with life all up and down its trunk. It's really exciting. Here's another perspective of this with a madrone trunk that has had bark damage that looks like it's still alive, but this fuzzing out, these bottle brush redwoods stand as a reminder that these trees can keep growing. So number 7, the technical term is epicormic sprouting, but I like to call it fuzzing out. So that's the bright spot number 7. Okay. We're now going to journey east, and we're going to move over to the Sierra Nevada. And the Sierra Nevada mountains have experienced many fires, many very large fires in recent years. They are on fire right now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some places that we know actually are burning this week. But I want to go back to the rim fire that happened in 2013. And at the time when the rim fire was burning, for me, it just seemed like the mega fire, you know, one of these first huge fires in California that I had experienced in my lifetime. And it ended up burning 250,000 acres. I know for all of us reading the news right now, that number doesn't even seem that big to us anymore, as fires are covering more and more acreage all the time. But the rim fire was a very large fire that burned through the Stanislaus National Forest. It burned into Yosemite and across private lands, including industrial timberland. And I want to talk about a few things about a few spots that I visited after the rim fire. This is just a satellite image that shows the burn scar from the rim fire, the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir here, and then the fire as it affected a really large stretch of the landscape just northwest of Yosemite Valley. So we're starting on private land, and this is an industrial timberland forest that was very heavily impacted by the rim fire. There was a tremendous amount of tree mortality, and the timber company came through and did salvage logging after the burn. And this was a really shocking landscape to see, where so many of the trees were gone. And I went there with the foresters from the company and with other researchers, and we were looking at this landscape. But I wanted to point out a few things. Remember, is the forest, you know, half empty, half burned, or is there still life there? And this picture really summarized what it felt like to be there for me. We saw big patches where it looked like the forest was totally gone. And then we would see single trees where at least some of the crown was still alive. For pines and firs, typically if you have a third to at least a quarter of the crown still alive, that tree may make it if it doesn't have other structural damage. So this tree here in the center of the photograph is a tree that might definitely make it. And you can see there are patches of trees that were not burned, where you do have green crowns going all the way down through the bole of the tree. Those are places that are going to be really important for restoring the forest around it. Those are places where the microclimate will be different, where seeds may be able to establish, seedlings may have a better chance of growing, and where other biodiversity is going to be able to live in those patches. I also want to point out, just to, you know, continue to hammer this nail, there are a lot of ferns that have popped out on the ground. So again, my constant source of hope from the ferns. One of the other interesting things that we found, and sometimes if you go very quickly after a fire, a tree will look green and it will look like it's alive and it's making it. And if you come back months later, it may have died. So there might be some time it takes for a tree to actually succumb to fire damage. But in other cases, it's the opposite. A tree can look fully dead, and then all of a sudden you realize that the tree is still alive, or parts of the tree is still alive. And here are some foresters being as fascinated as I was, looking at this branch of a giant sequoia that had that epicormic sprouting. It was a seemingly dead tree, but then one branch seemed to have made it, which suggests that this tree may actually be able to recover some amount of its crown, which is really interesting. And this was the first place that I actually saw giant sequoia send out basal sprouts. That's not typically something that this tree species does, unlike its cousin, the coast redwood, but we saw it on some trees. So nature finds a way. There are trees that are able to recover. They will be forever changed by a fire like this, but it doesn't always mean mortality, even for some of what look like the most damaged trees. And these trees were growing rapidly as well. So even with a lot of dead foliage still hanging on the trees, we were beginning to see those signs of the trees growing, the bark splitting with the new bark emerging, because this tree was increasing in girth. So these hopeful signs, and I mentioned before, often, especially for giant sequoia, if you clear out the vegetation around them, they have growth surge. They really don't like competing with others for space and water and nutrients, and a fire can do so much for clearing out space around giant sequoia. They love it, and they'll put on a nice, good, fat tree ring of growth following fire if they're not having to heal too much from their own fire damage. So sticking with the aftermath of the rim fire, but moving slightly further east into Yosemite National Park, there was the most amazing research study that was done looking at one of the mostly unnoticed species in the forest that did incredibly well because of the fire. Especially in a white fir dominated forests that burn, and that happens quite a lot in this area, and especially happened during the rim fire, you can have this prevalence of Morel mushrooms. And this study looked at how much of the forest burned and how that correlated with how many mushrooms came up post-fire. And this was really interesting to see that most of the places where a tremendous crop of morel mushrooms, which are delicious, by the way, were emerging were the places where all of the forest in that plot was burned, sometimes burned all the way down to the ground in a really hot, intense fire. That's when a lot of morels popped up. So in an average burn year in white fir, it's predicted that there are over 1 million morel mushrooms that can come up in Yosemite, which is pretty incredible. So I'm gonna say that that's a bright spot, the exceptional morel crops that can happen after intense fire. And that's not unique to the Sierra Nevada, it happens in other forests in the West. So Yosemite has had an active prescribed fire program throughout the park, and this is representative of the National Park Service and their deep commitment to maintaining fire on the landscapes in the national parks. For several decades, they've been working to use fire as a management tool and to proactively let fire back onto the landscape to do its job, to recycle nutrients, to reduce the density of trees in the forest, to protect the monarch trees by that act of clearing out vegetation, providing bare ground for giant sequoia seeds to germinate. And this has been such an inspiring source of hope for me every time I hear about these fire crews in national parks doing this important work, going into these forests to make sure that we don't exclude fire to the detriment of these forests going forward. And even when there isn't the personnel or the money or the expertise to do prescribed fire, there are proxies for fire, including mechanical thinning of the manual removal of smaller trees, tightly crowded stands of trees, to thin it out and to allow there to be more space for the remaining trees to grow. These stewardship and restoration activities are shown through so many scientific studies in forests across the West to be effective, and that they have the benefit of stimulating growth in the trees left behind. They create habitat structure, and they do the most important thing when we're thinking about wildfires. They prevent the catastrophic wildfires from going up, accelerating up into the canopy of the forest that are the type of fires that actually can kill our largest, oldest trees, and we don't want that. So investing in stewardship where we do that sort of thinning and bring fire back in proactively through prescribed burning is tremendously important. And it creates an opportunity to have space around the biggest, oldest trees. And so I love finding monarchs in the forest that have the space around them. It means that they're going to be the most safe trees when the fire inevitably does come through the environment. So my next bright spot number 9, is the space that gets created around trees, either from regular fires coming through or through mechanical thinning. It really is just one of the best things that we can do to help our forests, is to proactively do this kind of forest management. So the last giant sequoia stop is in the Giant Sequoia National Monument. So it's south of Yosemite, here down in the southern Sierra Nevada. And the Giant Sequoia National Monument has many giant sequoia groves that are spectacular. Alder Creek, with this red dot right there, is a property in the heart of the Sequoia National Monument that's home to the 5th largest giant sequoia by volume living today. This is the Stag Tree. This is a forest that's owned by Save the Redwoods League, and the forest has burned this week. And we don't know what the fate is going to be for the beautiful trees in this forest. but my thoughts are with my colleagues at Save the Redwoods League that have been working to design the stewardship this grove and others to make sure that these monarchs are going to be protected. So I'll be waiting with bated breath, thinking about the bright spots that hopefully the forest has been thinned enough that these monarchs like the stag tree are going to make it. And just a few miles away in Black Mountain Grove, I had the most profound experience in a burned forest that I've had for my whole life. And this was at Black Mountain Grove. This is part of the Giant Sequoia National Monument. It's Forest Service property. And it burned in 2017 in the Pier Fire. And when I went to visit it with my colleagues, I was absolutely shocked and stunned to see the amount of devastation in a giant sequoia forest. Here's just a small example of what the landscape looked like. The fire raged up from lower elevations up through a ravine up onto a ridgetop. And so there were many trees that had died. And we often expect smaller trees, the pines and the firs, the cedars to go up and die when a fire moves through like this. But we weren't expecting to see the giant sequoia more than we did. I will point out before I show you some depressing photographs that there are ferns that are alive though, down there on the ground. So up on this ridgetop, walking around, we were finding places where almost all of them had died. An incredibly intense hot fire had come through. And that was really, really shocking, but it was at the end of a pretty intense drought period that we had. And so 2012 through 2015, really dry years, drier years that we had had in California for centuries. So these trees were probably already pretty dry and drought stressed when the fire came through, and that may have contributed to the mortality we were seeing. But standing in a collection of giant sequoia, old giant sequoia that have died is an incredibly devastating experience. And I'm sharing this with you not because I want you to be so sad about these trees that have died. I mean, it was incredibly powerful and moving to see this, but because there was so much hope on the ground. The giant sequoia have cones that produce seeds that they keep in the crowns of their trees. And these seeds rain down, especially during fire. And when we walk through these burned areas, look at the tint on the ground, look at the green. There was a carpet of giant sequoia seedlings, tiny giant sequoia seedlings, all below the dead trees. It was truly remarkable, and I've never seen anything like this in a giant sequoia forest before. But the next generation of giant sequoia were there. They were there underfoot. We were having a hard time walking around and not stepping on them. There were so many baby giant sequoia, it was incredible. And I love this because it showed that even if the canopy was gone, if the old trees were gone, the next generation was here. And so it was inspiring to us as forest managers to think about the opportunity here to do right by these seedlings, to make sure that we take care of this forest and allow this forest to grow back or to grow into whatever the new forest is going to be of the future. The forest like this, with so many young seedlings coming up, is going to need help. Normally in the past, if an intense fire came through, many other fires would come through routinely. All of these giant sequoias cannot grow and turn into monarchs. They wouldn't be able to do that. They would be competing against themselves. So this forest is going to need a lot of careful stewardship and management. And in some of these places, all of the seeds have now germinated. So we've got one more chance to make sure that the giant sequoia come back in places like this. So it's a very profound responsibility, and it's also what an amazing opportunity. And it's just lovely to see them coming up. I love seeing the young seedlings coming up with the charred larger trees in the background. It just tells us what our job is going forward, and I find a lot of inspiration in that. So that's my bright spot, number 10, seeds. They are the future forest, and we can do right by them. Okay, so finally, we're going to leave California, as I did last year when I came to Arizona, and we're going to go to the Sky Islands just north of Tucson. Mount Lemmon is popular mountain that's used for recreation for pretty much everybody I know here in Tucson. It's a beautiful place. And it burned this summer in the Bighorn Fire. More than 120,000 acres of the Santa Catalina Mountains burned. And all summer, it felt like for weeks on end, I would look out of my backyard in the evening and I would see the fire as it moved west to east over mountain ranges. And it was very painful to watch, not knowing what was happening up there, how intense the fire was, what was happening to the springs, these water sources that are hidden in the mountains and important oases of water for biodiversity. It's really painful to watch. And I decided it was finally time, now that the Catalina Highway is open again, that I needed to go and see what was happening. So with my family, we drove up onto Mount Lemmon on Sunday. And as we started driving up there, I had tears in my eyes because I was so nervous about what we were going to find. I think even though I'm a scientist and try to be rational, you know, my fear was that everything was gone. And I think so many of us, when we're thinking about fires in places that we love and in our communities, that is the fear of the loss. And as we drove up the mountain, I began to see patches of green. You know, the forest was half unburned in places. And I really felt so much better after I got up to the peak, having gone all the way up there. And there are places where you go at the top of Mount Lemmon and you see that large swaths of the forest have burned. Many of the canopy trees are gone. Of course, the ferns are okay and they're bright green underneath it. I told you, you're going to see that everywhere when you go into burn forests. So there certainly were places of high intensity fire that are going to change the structure of this landscape for decades. There were places where fire had come multiple times. There's a 2003 on Mount Lemmon, the Aspen Fire, that burned many of the pine forests. And fire came through some of those places again. Now, I've been talking about how more frequent fire is important and can be very beneficial to the forest, and that's true. However, when forests now are under a different climate regime and it's much drier, we are concerned about the loss of the ability of the next generation of seeds, especially pine seeds, to be able to germinate. Do we still have cool enough, moist enough microhabitats for these trees to germinate? So we're going to be looking really carefully at these patches of forest that now have burned twice in the last couple of decades. But again, you know, trying to put the rosy glasses on my face, I saw many young trees that survived the fire. And one of the things that was so wonderful to see are places where what I would consider a healthy fire, low intensity fire, came through the Sky Island pine forests and probably did the best thing for the forest, starting to reduce some of the density of the trees, reduce the crowding, lower the fuel so that if this does fire, the fire does burn again soon because of a lightning strike, that maybe it won't be super intense and a catastrophic fire in these places. So these patches of light fire were so exciting to see. See pine trees where, yep, there's some burning up the tree, some damage to the bark. The tree is dealing with that wound. We'll be going back and I'll be fascinated to see if these larger trees are able to heal and survive the damage from the Bighorn Fire. Also saw landscapes where there's still forest. It's changed because the fire has come through, of course. There aren't as many plants in the understory, but the ferns are back. There are wildflowers that are up there. I heard so many birds while I was up there. And so I don't have a recording of the sounds, but it really felt to me like there was life up there in the Catalina Mountains and on Mount Lemmon. And I was so inspired by that. So if you are here in Tucson, if you feel like you need to get out of the house and go and experience it, it's worth driving up the mountain. I think you're going to be inspired by what's still on the mountain. And I want us to harness that energy so that we can invest back into Coronado National Forest and work with our agency partners to figure out how we're going to restore the mountain, how we're going to help support the diversity of life on this mountain following this major fire. So that's my 11th and final bright spot is just that there are these low intensity fire patches on the landscape, and they're so incredibly important because those are places where fire is probably doing the right thing, it's helping the forest, and these are going to be the anchors for restoration going forward. These are going to be the sources of seed for places surrounding where there may have been higher intensity fire. This is where animals are going to have remaining habitat to be able to survive while they wait for more of their habitat to grow back. So we're going to be looking intensely of where there is life up in these mountains and how we can be supporting populations of species. And the low intensity fire patches are a huge source of inspiration to me. So here we go. Just to summarize what we've talked about, we've explored a bunch of different things that I think for me helped me realize that life can continue. There are so many species that are adapted to fire, ecosystems that need fire, craving it. Things that we can do, techniques like prescribed fire and thinning to help set our forests up to adapt to more frequent fires, more intense fires because of climate change. And I think if we all find our own sources of inspiration here, then as a society, we can come together and say we want to manage our forests differently. We want to invest in stewardship and taking care of the land. And we want to restore our forests because we love them and we get so much out of them. We need them. So with that, I'm happy to try to answer questions that you may have. I'm not going to be able to speak very well about the forest fires that are burning right now. I simply don't have the facts about many of the fires that are going on, but I'm happy to hear your feedback. And I'm going to give you just 1 minute of what it looks like on the top of Mount Lemmon right now. Just give you a moment of forest bathing. Okay, so with that, thank you for listening and tuning in, and Megan's gonna share with me some of your questions so I can do my best to answer them.
Yes, we got a lot of good questions all of a sudden. So the first one is about woodpeckers and responding to fire. And they talked about the black-backed woodpecker. They're not in Arizona, but I can speak to this question a little bit. There are woodpeckers in Arizona that respond to fire. I was on Mount Graham when the 2017 fire went through, and within a month, acorn woodpeckers were back in the burned trees because the soft wood is perfect habitat. So it's not the same species, but similar response, which is pretty cool.
That is awesome.
I don't want to speak to that anymore, Emily.
That's great.
So the next question is do the ponderosa forests in Arizona respond similarly to redwoods? And would you say like the succession of mammals is similar?
Well, the ponderosa pine forests, their seeds also need that cleared out soil for them to be able to germinate. One of the things that researchers are concerned about with the pine forest here is, do we still have that germination niche? Because climate is changing so rapidly, we have drier conditions. So there is concern that there are going to be places where we may not be able to have natural seed regeneration happening in the forest. But the way that the ecosystem is going to respond, there will be other species. Even if ponderosa pine can't regerminate in every place, there will be other species that are likely to be successful. And so I think what we often talk about in fire ecology is these shifting mosaics of sometimes where you had a stand of ponderosa pine, it may not be that same kind of ponderosa pine forest in the future, but it might shift, the species composition may change, and it may become something else. Ponderosa pine might do well in different areas. And the species that live in these forests are going to be assembling with the combination of plants where they get their food and their sources, their food sources and shelter and things like that. So we're going to be expecting some change. What we love to see is when replacement of species happens with other native species. So those are the kind of things that we can encourage. And I know for the Catalinas, we'll be working with the Forest Service to figure out if there are appropriate places to do planting and try to get larger trees established. So these are all things that are actively under discussion, but plans are not defined yet because it's still so soon after the fire.
Next question is from Carol about the recording. It'll be available on our YouTube channel and on our website by tomorrow for the public. So keep an eye out for that. It looks like that's all the questions. There's a few discussions happening, but.
Okay. Well, I welcome everyone to find their own sources of inspiration in this really hard year, this really hard times. I think it's so important to go out and be part of nature. If you find your own bright spots in places that have been infected by fire, please share them with us. We'd love to see them. We are going to be collectors of hope going forward, and we'd love you to be part of that with us. So
we got one last question. Sorry.
Oh,
it's about mushrooms, so I wanted to include it. Is there any more information about the mycelium in fire recovery? Do you know?
I know there is research on that. That's not my field of expertise. We could definitely look and see if there are some relevant studies that are ongoing here in the Sky Island region. I'd be happy to research that and look into it. I know that the underground bodies of the fungal species are really important in helping trees get nutrients. So mycorrhizal species can be really important in helping trees grow. And I would hypothesize that after fire, where the soil didn't get overheated, those mycelia are going to be part of that process where these tree species are growing more quickly. The individual trees grow really quickly after fire to take advantage of that nutrient pulse. So yeah, I will look into that and try to get some more information about what's known in our area.
And sorry, one last question. I can respond to Frederick's about the Mount Lemmon fire. I'm not as familiar, but I do know the severity of that fire has hindered the regrowth. It's been really slow in comparison to like more natural fires, just because of the huge intensity of that fire. So it is a little unfortunate that another big one just went through. But there is regrowth, and the patchiness does give hope.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us today. I hope you're leaving this coffee break with a little bit more hope that we can continue to take care of our forests and help them recover. And I hope to see you in 2 weeks for our next coffee break to explore the springs of Sonora. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Emily. That was great. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
This is my first. I'll be coming back.